There are three general starting points within criminology, and these are called perspectives. And so these aren't theories so much as there'd be a collection of theories that fall under each perspective. So they're kind of an overarching way of thinking under which you're going to find multiple different specific theories. So these are the consensus perspective, the conflict perspective, and the interactionist perspective. So let's go ahead and start with the consensus perspective. So the consensus perspective basically says, just like what it sounds like, everybody is in consensus in general. So basically crimes then are defined as some kind of behavior that most or all elements of society kind of believe this to be a bad thing that we don't want to have. So crimes are behaviors that most or all elements of the society would agree we don't want to have in our society. We have a consensus about that. So in general, people agree about what's right, what's wrong, and then society kind of works together towards the common and shared vision of the greater good. So we are all kind of working together to be better as a society, and this is why we need to stop crime and why crime is a bad thing, and we all kind of basically agree that these are the things we want and these are the things that we don't want. So there are four main principles of this consensus perspective. And first is that there is the belief in the existence of core values. So right off the bat, it is basically an assumption that there are such a thing as core values, meaning that there are values that are shared by the majority of society. The law then reflects the collective will of the people based on those core values. So this is basically that the law in general is meant to protect everybody, and we all basically agree about what should be in there, and we all support the law, essentially the way it stands, but this is kind of why it changes and to sort of reflect the will of the people. Also, another big assumption of the consensus perspective is that the law serves everybody equally. And so if we are all in agreement about what's right and what's wrong, and we all agree about the laws, then essentially if somebody breaks the laws, we should all be in agreement that that needs to be dealt with and how that needs to be dealt with. And so from this perspective, the law is serving everybody the same way. And so then from this perspective, people who violate the law then are something different. They're the ones that do not fit in. They're this unique subgroup with some kind of distinguishing features that we can then, study and try to figure out what those things are to try to explain and predict criminality. So then the conflict perspective is a little bit different. So the conflict perspective basically sees society as a collection of diverse groups who are always in conflict. So you don't have that overall consensus like we have in the consensus perspective. Rather, there are distinct groups that think very differently. And so conflict then is a fundamental part of social life. You can't ever really resolve the conflict because people are so at odds and they think differently, and they will never agree about what's right or what's wrong or what should be in the laws. Everything is in conflict, and these groups will never be able to sort of come to terms with that. So there are 5 major principles of the conflict perspective. The first is that we have these diverse groups. So it's the assumption that there are diverse social groups that do think differently, they behave differently, they believe different things, they have different ways of seeing the world. The second is that each group differs in terms of what they view as right versus wrong. So not only are they diverse and different and they think differently, but they also differ in terms of determining what's right and wrong in terms of behavior and what we kind of want to criminalize. The third is that conflict is unavoidable. So these groups are never going to agree, they're never going to think the same way, so conflict is inevitable. It's going to happen. So from this perspective, law is not applied equally the way that it is in the consensus perspective, but rather it's a tool of the powerful. And so it is used to further the interests of those that have that power. And so the people that wield that power are able to basically use the laws to make society the way that they want it to be and according to how they see the world and how their group views things, and what their group, whatever social group they're part of. Because remember, we have these different groups, so they're going to make the laws based on what their group wants, and also in order to keep it. So the people who have that power want to keep that law, want to keep that power that they have over the laws, and so they work really hard to protect it. And so that means they will form laws that will protect them and the people around them, and they will use those laws to keep themselves in power. So very different from the consensus perspective, and you can probably think of a couple of theories that could fall under that. One, of course, being Marxism. So the interactionist perspective is the third one, and this is kind of you have like consensus and conflict on polar opposites, and interactionist kind of falls somewhere in the middle. So in the interactionist perspective basically says that you have people, institution, and events are viewed very subjectively. So nothing is objective, so we don't have these diverse objective groups because everything is subjective. And so the label of somebody being good or evil, or an act or behavior being good or evil, is totally up to the interpretation of who is evaluating it. And so that can change depending on who that evaluator is. So society is guided by those with power and influence still. So in this way, it's kind of a little bit more along the lines of the conflict perspectives, but it affects changes in policies so that they want kind of similar to the conflict perspective, that they want those policies to align with their opinions and their beliefs, but it's not about holding power. It's more about how they see society as what society needs. And so they're not in conflict with one another, but they're driven by the morals of who we look up to. So these are people that we look up to for what they say is morally right or wrong, and then we follow them. And so they still have that power, but they don't wield it in the same way as we would view it from the conflict perspective. So in a sense, they actually change our minds to align with theirs, and so they have that influence over us. And so then we kind of will get on board with, whatever their moral crusade of the day might be. And so they actually make us think the way that they do because of that power and influence that they have. So the four major principles of the interactionist perspective, first one is there is no objective reality. Everything is subjective. Everything is about, who is doing the interpreting. The second major assumption is that the process then to define crime is subjective. So since there is no objective reality, then by definition, crime is also subjective. And so that process to figure out what is a crime and what is not a crime, everything is subjective. Then that means that the criminal label is applied based on the interpretations of the behavior. And usually this means interpretations by a judge or a jury, but there can also be the court of public opinion, and that can play a role as well. And so what is considered a crime then reflects the opinions and the morals of those with that social power. And so the difference from the conflict perspective is that those with power may or may not be politicians. It might be, people it could be like religious leaders. It could be people who are leaders in the media. It doesn't have to be politicians the way that the conflict perspective really views it. And also it's not about money. It's about their sense of morality. So it's about, what the people with the power want to actually, how they want society to be. And so they're going to try to make laws or influence us to make laws that align with that morality, which we kind of agree with. So those are kind of the three major perspectives. And so all of the theories, the criminological theories, will align with one of those kind of starting points. So it's kind of a way of thinking that then we come up with specific theories from that. Another way that we can sort of have starting points when we're looking at criminological theory is through what's called the social problems perspective versus the social responsibility perspective. So this essentially, the social problems perspective basically says that crime is this manifestation of some kind of major social problems that are beyond the control of any individual. And so the major underlying drive of crime is not anything about the person so much as there are problems in society that we need to address in order to reduce crime. And so it really goes about it a way of, there are problems that make it so that certain individuals are more likely to engage in criminal behavior, and so, but it's not about anything about the individual. It's about what society has created for that person, and it could be based on groups. It could be based on things like, poverty or socioeconomic status, or it could be based on race, it could be based on gender, it could be based on sexuality, it could be based on a whole bunch of things that put certain people at risk of committing crimes, but it's because of the underlying problems, and it's not because of anything about any individuals. But this is also basically that, if we want to solve crime, we need to look at bigger picture things. So things like we need to increase access to education. We need to increase the, ability for job training and job placement. And, we need to address crime-prone areas and things like that. And those are the real problems that are causing crime. This is compared to the social responsibility perspective, which basically takes the complete opposite perspective, and it says crime is a matter of individual responsibility. And so, this would have theories that look at things about the person. So maybe it could be about their background, maybe it could be about their, could be psychological factors. It could be actually any of those factors that I mentioned for the social problems perspective, but bringing it to the individual as opposed to it being a societal issue. But essentially, crime is seen as, well, you still chose to commit this crime, and so there's something about you that is different, and it actually goes very, very well in line with the consensus perspective, because that is basically the idea that, well, we all agree, that these things are wrong and that we shouldn't be doing this, and so you have done something wrong by committing this crime, and so hence why you need to be punished. And retribution is a big part of the social responsibility perspective, although there can be a real rehabilitative approach too, but it's still more directed at the person, the individual, as opposed to fixing underlying societal problems. So this is another way that we can have starting points in terms of looking at theories, and theories kind of develop out of one of these two ways. So this is kind of completely separate from when we look at the consensus versus the conflict versus the interactionist perspective. Those are three starting points, and these are two other separate starting points. So they don't fall under one another or in line with each other. They're kind of just two different ways we can think of having starting points when it comes to criminological theory.